Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Morbid Symptoms Podcast. I'm your host, Tara Van Dyke. We have a great episode. Alexander Mckay from the Marx Engels Lenin Institute is going to be with us. And I asked him to come on because he streamed on what he called Bad Trot Takes on West Asia when it comes to anti-imperialism. And I wanted to bring him on to get his response to Chris Cutrone, who calls himself the last Marxist. He was one of the founders of the Platypus Society, and he appears quite a bit on Sublation Media. He's one of their go-to philosophy and theory guys, particularly when it comes to anything to do with Marxism. And he recently had what I would consider to fall into what Alexander would call a bad trot take on West Asia. Chris Cutrone has made two recent interventions on this issue, one called An Alternative to Genocide, which was in Sublation magazine, and one called Israel, Palestine, and the Left in quotation marks in the Platypus online journal. So basically, the overall theme is that there is a division, a divide on the left. And within the left, of course, the left includes Marxists of different stripes and non-Marxist. You can be socialist and not a Marxist, or you can consider yourself to be on the left. It's a motley crew. But in particular, focusing on the divide on the left, some would call the Trotskyist or neo-Trotskyist left or Marxists, and the more Marxist-Leninists who aren't afraid of Stalin, who don't shy away from that part of the history and the lessons that can be learned from it, bad, good, and otherwise. So Alexander's going to come on to do and give his take on Cutrone's take, a kind of exemplar of the bad trot take that he's been critiquing quite vociferously. He's going to talk about how this is another Trotskyist misinterpretation or mystification of anti-imperialist struggles and the larger question of what's the relationship between anti-imperialism and Marxism. Cutrone has said several times that Marxism is not anti-materialism, and those who are making the argument that it is, for example, like Midwestern Marx, Infrared, etc., and I guess the American Communist Party that recently formed, would be those he'd be critiquing for being deluded, or he calls them children who think that this is the way to go. If there's anything positive in terms of the pursuit of socialism to be found in any way within these resistance movements, whether they be Hamas, the Palestinian resistance with Hamas as the figurehead in Palestine, or with Hezbollah in Iran, or the Axis of resistance in general. He would have an issue with people who think there's anything Marxist or positive in terms of a development of socialism in the Middle East or in the States through this. Anyway, to set the stage, let me briefly summarize my understanding of a Trotskyist approach to the Middle East and North Africa post-World War II, which is crucial for understanding where Cutrone's arguments fit into this ideological framework of political debate. So Trotskyism emphasizes international socialism and the theory of permanent revolution. So Trotskyists critique imperialism, not just Western interventions in the region, but also nationalist movements they see as collaborating with capitalist powers, such as Nasserism in Egypt or the Baathists in Iraq or Syria. So this perspective also extends to the Palestinian struggle, where Trotskyists oppose both Zionism and the limitations of Arab nationalist leadership. They argue for a socialist Palestine where Jews and Arabs coexist and some sort of socialist state that should be in the foreground. This analysis is also very critical of political Islamism, or what he would probably call Islamofascism, viewing it as a reactionary force that diverts the working class from socialist revolution. So Cutrone's recent analysis of Hamas and Israel-Palestine conflict raises questions that seem to echo certain Trotskyist concerns from these previous rounds, if we go back a few decades after the period of Arab nationalism. So Cutrone critiques nationalist violence. People who are supporting Hamas, the resistance in general, are prioritizing violence over international working class solidarity. His article, An Alternative to Genocide, which is basically a critique of Hamas, and then by extension, all those who think that there's any upside to having any kind of coalition or solidarity with groups like them. So he thinks that Palestinians should have focused on labor solidarity with Israeli workers rather than falling into the quote unquote trap of nationalist resistance. So let's see. This is a summary of Chris Cutrone's Alternative to Genocide, which was in Sublation magazine this summer. He characterizes Hamas as an organization that, rather than fostering a path towards socialism or any kind of better future for Palestinians, particularly workers, has destroyed the possibility of solidarity between Palestinians and Israeli laborers. He argues that Hamas recruits angry, unemployed young men, transforming them into soldiers rather than workers. Hamas is all interested in soldiers and not in labor. According to Cutrone, this militarization serves Hamas's ultimate goal of becoming a state, and states inherently perpetuate violence and war. Cutrone contrasts this with a Marxist idea that workers, not militants or nationalists, are the agents of socialism. And it's a mistake to think first we'll deal with the anti-imperialism. We'll go ahead with the nationalism, Islamo-nationalism, or whatever we may find, because imperialism is always bad. And as good leftists or Marxists, we always have to side with the occupied over the occupiers, or framing it in terms of settler colonialism and whatnot. And he thinks all this is a bad road to go down. And in the end, won't do anything for socialism, let alone the typical Palestinian in Gaza or the West Bank. He also suggests that Hamas's actions, particularly terrorism, have undermined any potential for class solidarity between Palestinians and Israelis, and instead further entrench the cycle of violence. For Cutrone, the only true alternative to this cycle and to extermination is for Palestinian workers to embrace life under capitalism, at least for now, and pursue their survival through labor rather than martyrdom. He argues that Hamas's rhetoric of noble death is aristocratic and ultimately destructive, denying workers the possibility of life in solidarity. So for the left, especially the Marxist left, Hamas is as much your enemy as Netanyahu is. That Islamism, you should be against that as much as you are Zionism and as much as you are of Western imperialism. And he sees this as basically just a war of different bourgeois classes, one quite well more armed than the other, but the resistance isn't critical of capitalism at all. They just want to get Western interest. They want to have capitalism be ran by Arabs and Persians, etc., not by Western interests, and Israel being the kind of beachhead of Western imperial actions in the region. Hello, Alexander. How are you doing?
Hello, Sarah. How are you?
I'm all right. I've given a very potted introduction to Chris Cutrone's takes on Israel, Palestine, the left, and anti-imperialism and Marxism. And I just summarized Chris's alternative to genocide, which he's trying to educate us that Hamas is the super duper villain here, and that anybody who in any way is fooled to think that there's any benefit of any kind of partial or any kind of solidarity with them is a child, basically. So let's see. How should we do this? I have a 2-slide summary of Chris's Israel, Palestine, and the Left article. I could quickly go through that and then toss it over to you for your initial take on his characterization. Does that
Yeah,
sound okay?
that sounds good to me.
Okay. So now moving on to Israel, Palestine, and the Left by Chris Cutrone. He put the left in quotation marks. Of course, there's a debate on what's in and what's out of that. So he starts off with the legalities. So he reflects on the term genocide, critiquing how it has been institutionalized and codified into law, which allows for its discussion, but also opens the door for it to be normalized or diluted. He contrasts the Holocaust with other historical atrocities, like the partition of India, and poses critical questions about how the Israeli Palestinian conflict is framed, especially in terms of international attention. He's gone as far as to say that it's a mistake and that it's wrongheaded to talk about this in terms of even ethnic cleansing or genocide, that it's counterproductive. Lenin and Trotsky. He contrasts Leninism and Stalinism in the context of international law and the United Nations, criticizing the idea of cultural genocide and the notion of national autonomy for oppressed groups. Trotsky's perspective is invoked to critique how some of the left misinterpret revolutionary defeatism, failing to see how capitalism forces benefit from war while workers do not. He also criticizes the Palestinian solidarity movement in the United States, focusing on its demands like ceasefire now and defund Israel. He sees these as demands on the capitalist state that mirror liberal reformist activism like BLM's call to defund the police. He argues that these demands play into capitalist politics and fail to advance any meaningful socialist agenda, whether there or here. On the topic of genocide, again, he discusses the charge of genocide against Israel, arguing that the concept is being misapplied. He suggests that Palestinians lost in their conflict with Israel and that no amount of protest or refusal to surrender will change that. He critiques the recent Hamas attack as a desperate, futile move and sees Hamas's action as public relations stunt with no real chances of success. Gangster rap, he uses that to characterize Hamas as a capitalist criminal enterprise or racket with its leadership profiting off the misery of Palestinians. He criticizes the left for supporting Hamas, claiming that terrorism, as Hamas practices it, divides the working class and does not align with socialist goals. He emphasizes that Hamas is part of the capitalist system, not a force for socialist change. Lenin again. Returning to Lenin, Cutrone critiques the nation-state system as inherently capitalist and oppressive. He emphasizes that socialism requires international working class unity, which is undermined by nationalist and religious divisions like those fostered by Zionism and Hamas, and he would say Islamism more broadly. He asserts that divisions among people are rooted in capitalism itself, and until socialism is achieved, these divisions will persist, leading to ongoing conflict and war. So throughout both these articles, he critiques the left's approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Hamas's role within it, arguing that both failed to advance the cause of socialism and instead perpetuate capitalist violence and division. And he basically, like, Hamas are gangsters, Hamas are thugs. They want to control they want the capitalist booty for themselves. They have more money than Trump. They're real estate moguls, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And basically the idea that a pox on both their houses. For an actual Marxist, there's nothing here. You can kind of say this is terrible. It's crappy that we're here, but there's no players on the board that a Marxist should be in any kind of coalition or solidarity with.
Well, I think we should start with the fact that Chris Cutrone misuses Lenin and willfully misinterprets Lenin's position on the nation state. Now, Cutrone, I would argue, isn't following Lenin on the nation state. He's following the likes of Benedict Anderson, the brother of Perry Anderson. I think they're both coming from a Trotskyite tradition. Of course, Perry Anderson, the luminary of New Left Review. And Benedict Anderson in his work...
He had imaginary communities, right?
Imagined communities, yeah. This is the thesis Cutrone is working off here, arguing on the one hand that he argues because capitalism is now a global system, it's all-encompassing, and therefore that renders all national struggles fundamentally irrelevant, basically, because everything's in capitalism. He's deliberately avoiding two things about Lenin's work. One, Lenin's understanding and analysis of imperialism, and two, Lenin's insistence upon the need to resolve the national question. Now, one of these flows from the other. Now, in a series of debates in World War I, and I'm focusing on Lenin because I'm taking Cutrone on his own terms, he will reject out of hand if I quoted from Stalin and Mao. So let's just go with his examples and let's deal with Lenin's work on imperialism and the nation state. He doesn't quote anything from Lenin on imperialism, by the way, because Cutrone, I don't think, believes imperialism is a thing. He just says capitalism. So in a series of debates with Rosa Luxemburg and Felix Dzerzhinsky and others in the middle of World War I, Cutrone should be aware of these because they're on the Marxist Internet Archive. It's all in there and it's all in the collected works of Lenin. Now, Luxemburg, and I believe Cutrone would probably see himself as following on from her. She was born in Poland. Her family were Jewish. She grew up in Poland and spent a lot of her time in Germany. She always rejected the primacy of the national question in Poland, because at the time, Poland was, of course, divided between Tsarist Russia, Imperial Germany, and bits of it were in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. And as did Dzerzhinsky rejected this as well, who was also Polish by birth. And what they both argued was, well, these Polish nationalists are complete reactionaries. They're capitalists. They will not take the workers' struggle forward one iota. We can't prioritize the Polish national question. It's got to be revolution or it's got to be nothing. But I'm very broadly summarizing that. Lenin responds to that by arguing that unless the national question is solved in Poland, but you can apply this anywhere, then the revolution's going to go nowhere. Because on a purely political level, if communists don't act to solve the national question, other forces will. And in the case of Poland, those other forces will be ultra-Catholic, reactionary landowners who will take up the national question and use it against communists, saying, see, you don't want our nation to be free. So from a political level, that's a foolish mistake to make. It means you will not be addressing a question which is urgent, because we then extrapolate to see what the national question is composed of. And there's economic elements of that, and there's class elements of that in terms of hyper-exploitation of oppressed peoples by imperialism, whether that's in Poland in the 1900s or Palestine now, or in other nations that are oppressed now. But also there is such a thing as cultural and linguistic oppression as well. This does exist. Like the attempt to annihilate national languages, the attempt to annihilate national cultures. It's what the Ukrainian fascists were employed to do by their NATO masters. It's what the Zionists have been doing in occupied Palestine for many, many years now. And they continue to do it. They continue to try and annihilate the culture of those who have been resident in the land for hundreds and hundreds of years, and to push them into the margins, to change all the names of the cities that were long established by the resident Arab populations. So he rejects the notion that a population can be literally thrown off the land and extinguished, and he rejects this notion of cultural genocide, which I think is a shaky term and has been misused. But it's undoubtedly the case that when it comes to Israel, they have been literally trying to erase the culture of those who were there already on the land. He doesn't deal with that. But to go back to his misusage of Lenin, Lenin said that we have to address the national question. We have to stand for national liberation. And in that, he carried the day in the debates ultimately against Luxemburg and Dzerzhinsky and Trotsky and others, who all said, no, this is all nonsense, this is all reactionary, it's revolution or nothing. Well, in that case, what you end up with more often than not is nothing.
Yeah.
Because that, if you're not going to address that point, if you're not going to address the point that in oppressed nations, it's frequently the case that language is erased, that cultures are erased as part of an attempt to essentially render a population without and to have no identity and no sense of themselves at all, then, well, good luck organizing them as a class after that. Good luck at doing anything after that. But I don't think Chris is really interested in doing anything here. I think he's interested ultimately in excusing imperialism, which is why he doesn't deal with Lenin's work on imperialism. And this, the second point to come to about his misusage of Lenin comes to Lenin's thoughts on the nation state, but in terms of that which is emerging out of decolonization struggles. So let's just deal with like the history of the Soviet Union up to 1924 and Lenin's death. In that early part of the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik leaders welcomed an alliance with Sun Yat-sen, the leader of what became the Kuomintang in China. And Sun Yat-sen, of course, the first president of the First Republic of China, not a socialist, not a Marxist, but a bourgeois nationalist, but a sincere one, And he, that is Sun Yat-sen, welcomed the Bolshevik Revolution on the grounds that it was a great chance to enhance the national liberation struggle in China, which, as we all know, had suffered the century of humiliation, and the stirrings were there to try and bring this century of humiliation to a close. So he welcomed that alliance with Sun Yat-sen, an advocate of what you would call now a mixed economy in China, but not a socialist. And both the Chinese nationalist side and the Bolshevik side agreed that it was a useful alliance to have to end the influence of imperialism in China and to drive the imperialists out of China. Now, Chris Cutrone doesn't want to deal with any of that either, because then you have to get into the meat of the issue, which is what he's desperate to avoid, which is why is it advantageous to communists or socialists or whatever word you want to describe this as in both the West and the East and the oppressed nations to end imperialism? And again, he avoids this too, because what is it that US imperialism is getting out of the relationship with Israel? That's the question that has to be asked, because again, we see all the time now that Israel can't exist without all of this direct assistance from the US. So what is this, charity? No, it's not. It's an investment. It's an investment in Israel for the same purposes that the British originally took on board the Zionist movement over 100 years ago. It's to have this armed garrison right in the middle of West Asia on the strategically important trade routes that can be used to attack any and every force that tries to push these nations that, as Chris says, used to be part of the Ottoman Empire, tries to push them towards a more genuine level of independence and economic development. Chris Cutrone says, oh, well, all of these nationalist movements failed. Okay, well, I would not argue that Baathism or Nasserism or any of the other variations of which that have existed in that region were in any way perfect, but they did represent a significant step forward for these countries. Like NASA's development, no matter how flawed you might regard it as, took the industrial, educational, societal development of Egypt forward enormously in the period of time when his movement was in power before the capitulation of Sadat, his successor in the later 1970s. Like all the different indicators for life for the working class and the peasantry and for women in Egyptian society all went forward. And again, he doesn't deal with that, even in a more problematic terrain, such as Iraq, a country with a movement with a very dubious history, certain relationship with the CIA, one being one of them. But even there, social progress under these nationalist forces, however flawed they were, was important. The increased educational standards, increased industrial development, agricultural development, better healthcare outcomes, longer life expectancy. If Chris had ever lived without any of those, I don't think he'd be so ready to dismiss all of that. Same is true for a nation like Iran. I mean, I've covered this extensively. You mentioned the program I did on Bad Trot Takes on West Asia. Look at same things been achieved by, some will call it an Islamic revolution, some call it nationalist revolution. There are even some who claim it's Islamic socialism. I'm not one of them, but that claim does exist. But again, social outcomes, economic outcomes do matter here. I thought we were supposed to be materialists, so let's deal with the material, which is that life for the proletariat, all of the proletariat, both its male and female side, in Iran now is immeasurably better than it was under the Shah. Literacy levels, educational levels have all improved. Life expectancy has improved. Industrial development has gone up dramatically. Scientific achievements have improved. All these things matter enormously for the quality of life. Is the Iranian revolution my choice of revolution? Well, no, because I'm neither a Shia nor any kind of Muslim, nor am I Iranian. But the Iranian revolution started in 1979. And this is another thing that the Trots neglect. Revolutions aren't flash, bang, uprising, over. It's an ongoing struggle that often takes generations of struggles to actually see how a revolution will turn out. You can quote the famous line from Zhou Enlai when asked, what do you think about the French Revolution? He said, it's too soon to tell.
Yeah.
And like, same is true for Iran. Like, it's too soon to tell how that is going to play itself out in the end. That is a struggle which is live and ongoing. And rather than dismissing it, it would be far better for Chris to use his position as, I'm assuming, some kind of academic, to maybe study the things that interest him in Iran. So he claims to be interested in class contradictions. Well, why not study that rather than just dismissing this development that's taken place as some kind of, it's all just capitalism. But let's return to the Palestinian struggle and let's deal with his claim about, Hamas are, gangster capitalists or whatever stuff. Apparently, everybody who opposes the West is a gangster capitalist, whether it's Putin or Hamas or anybody else. The capitalist forces that do exist amongst the Palestinians, and they are there. There are Palestinian capitalists. Who are they keen on? It's Mahmoud Abbas. That's who they're with. Abbas's support in the West Bank in particular, a lot of it draws from the upper layers of Palestinian society in the West Bank, the people who want to deal with Israel, the people who want to deal with the United States, the people who would basically be prepared for the Palestinian proletariat and peasantry to be dispossessed and enslaved because they don't see that as a problem. And they're the ones who have always backed Abbas. They're the ones who were the shakiest part of the old PLO coalition because they were constantly looking for a deal with imperialism, and they were the ones who were the most connected to the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. And so the pro-capitalist elements, well, they're all about collaboration with the West. They're all about collaboration with the imperialists. So it's a complete misnomer. He's misleading his readers by saying, Hamas are all just pro-capitalist. It's like, well, the pro-capitalist elements made its choice, and the choice is collaboration with the West. That was why they lost to Hamas. All the way back in 2006, in those elections, they lost because they were running a completely corrupt, compromised, capitulationist regime that was all about getting that deal with the West at all costs, including the cost of national liberation. Final point to come to here about why socialists and communists should actually back national liberation struggles. And again, Chris doesn't get this because he doesn't want to talk about imperialism. Where do the profits of British and American capitalism really come from now? Do they come from internal investment inside the United States and Britain? Or do they come from external export of capital to other countries where hyper-exploitative conditions reign and where extra extraction of profit can be carried out via hyper-exploitation of the labor of the workers there? It's the latter. Much more so for us, because here in Britain, the oldest imperialist power, they are able to secure themselves in power, our ruling class, because they are still able to extract this surplus from the hyper-exploitation of these different workers all over in many areas of the world. The oppressed workers of the world, oppressed by neocolonialism, as Kwame and Nkrumah defined it. And so that's how our ruling class secures themselves in power. It's not by domestic manufacturing anymore. As I'm sure Chris would admit, there's questions about it. It's via the ability to extract these super profit from these different areas of the world. Israel is basically a regional cop enforcing that domination. And that's why it's so important for US imperialism to retain that. And so for us in the West, we have an interest in these people, the oppressed peoples, liberating themselves, even if it's on the basis of a coalition with what we in the bad old tanky land call national bourgeois, meaning the bourgeois are not a unified class, not here, not there. They're more so unified here, but in the oppressed nations, there are those who we've just been talking about who are linked to imperialism and have their business interests tied to imperialism. There are also those who, for whatever reason, maybe it's direct economic interests, maybe it's other things, who are of the bourgeois and are actually in some way committed to the development of a nation state. And at this point, we should sort of say, well, the bourgeois here, to secure themselves and create proper conditions for the development of capitalism, had to create their own modernized nation state. It's what the entire 17th century in Britain was about, you know, chasing out the feudal elements, uniting all the different corners of the British Isles, making sure that one system of laws governs the whole area, one justice system or a similar justice system which can defend property rights and enable the development of capitalism. That's what capitalism needed to grow in the 17th century into the 18th century, in Britain, in France, and in the United States as well. So why is it then that, this is where we come to Chris's Trotskyism, Chris Cutrone and others don't think that should be something which happens anywhere else. Trotskyists always say bourgeois revolutions are dead. Well, bourgeois revolutions exist because there's an objective need to modernize the country to enable the growth of the economic forces. So you can't grow a capitalist economy when you are dominated by imperialism, where imperialism reduces countries that are subjected to neocolonialism to mono economies, just pure extraction of natural resources, exporting of natural resources. And you can't develop if that's what you're laboring under. That's why you've got all those rebellions in the Sahel. So to actually develop a stronger proletariat, you have to have a level of industrial and agricultural development which enables the growth of socialism. Like Trotskyites always say, oh, well, Russia jumped from capitalism and semi-feudalism to socialism. Well, no, it actually didn't. There was an extended period of struggle that goes on from like 1921 through to 1930, at least 9 years, where they had to resort to capitalist methods and then go towards collectivization and mass industrialization because they were so far behind. So if there's national struggles which free nations from imperialism, which loosen the stranglehold of British and American and French imperialism, then that benefits not only the development of the proletariat in these countries and actually would enable a more comprehensive struggle for socialism, it also benefits us in terms of our ruling classes is then weakened because their ability to prop themselves up with the profits they extract from elsewhere in the world goes down the more that the different countries even get to the stage of just being able to assert basic bourgeois law inside their own borders and do basic things such as a more balanced industrial development, a more balanced agricultural development. So it's in our interest, if we're serious about the struggle for socialism in the imperial core, to weaken our own rule, to see our own ruling class weakened. Because at the moment, what they're doing is they're exporting capital and they're using the profits generated from that to just about managed to keep social peace here by keeping the inherent division in the working class going, which is the division between the labor aristocracy, the upper levels of the working class, and the great mass of everybody else. And so we should welcome these struggles to free not just Palestine, but all the different nations subjected to neo-colonialism as well, from the oppression imposed upon them by imperialism. And we should reach out to them and be in solidarity with them in that struggle. Now, and it's not down to us who conducts that struggle. We don't get to choose that. And I noticed that Chris not only rejects Hamas, he rejects the prior generation of liberation fighters. So he rejects the PFLP and all the other Marxist-Leninist groups that existed in the earlier phase of this struggle back in the 80s and the 70s. So they're not good enough for him either, because again, they insisted that the national questions should be solved. And he says that the October the 7th is a disaster and it won't lead to anything good and the Palestinians have lost. Well, Israel's not looking like winners right now. They're not looking like a winner. They've essentially been unable to defeat Hamas. Their economy's tanking and falling to pieces. They've had the worst attack on them, the Israeli interior, probably ever. They're undergoing a disaster. And he's claiming that they're winning because fundamentally, what it comes down to is this. People like Chris don't like revolutions. They don't like them. What they want is to be able to sit there doing book reviews and proclaiming every struggle is inadequate. None of it is good enough. And if the class-based movement that he says he wants emerged inside the United States, I will put, all the money in my wallet, which isn't a lot, but at least £10. I'd put at least £10 down as a bet to say that he would reject that. He would find a way to reject that. Trotskyites always do. And again, I'm glad he's come out and openly identified himself with the legacy of Trotsky because he's carrying it forward, complete consistency with the man himself. And this is the Trotskyite legacy. This is the Western left's legacy as well, which is the systematic rejection of every national liberation struggle, starting with Algeria all the way back in like the late 40s and early 1950s. I bet Chris would have been one of those, like Albert Camus, calling for a joint struggle between the Algerians and the French workers. Well, in the case of colonialism, the working class that did exist in places like Algeria and exists now in Israel gets, to a certain extent, cut in on the deal with regard to colonialism. This is an unfortunate thing. We have to face it if we're going to be serious here. Ever since the days of Cecil Rhodes, who was on record as saying this, Rhodes identified that if we don't cut a small layer of the working class in on the deal of colonialism, if we don't let some of the proceeds go to them, we're going to face real problems. And they certainly did that in Algeria. They certainly do that in Israel. In Israel, you can just turn up. You claim to be Jewish, get a certificate and go and claim some land. And if you are identified as being the right type of person in Israel, meaning someone who is Jewish, your rights as the lowest paid worker will be higher than those of a Palestinian. So we're not dealing with a class struggle in a sense that you can just say, solidarity, comrades, let's all gather and chase the same objectives, because objectively speaking, that working class that exists in Israel gets privileges from the oppression of the Palestinians. That's not something which is open to interpretation. We can just look at the legal codes. Look at what a standard paid worker gets in Israel in terms of legal rights, and look what the Palestinian worker gets next to him. Even a Palestinian who has an Israeli passport will be treated worse. And so where's the scope for this solidarity movement that's going to unite the entire working class that Chris Cutrone wants to see? Unfortunately, it doesn't exist. This is why we try to practice scientific socialism, because it has to proceed from a rigorous study of what actually exists, not a fantasy version of what we'd like to exist. And this, again, it's the same logic that led people like Michael Harrington, founder of the DSA, to reject both sides bad in the Vietnam War. I mean, that's one of the legacies that I bet Chris is probably quite proud of. Also, for Trotskyites to say both sides bad in the Korean War. So if you take this point of view, you can declare that the people fighting for national liberation are as bad as the imperialists, which is what he's doing, these articles. I'll pause there where I've spoken for quite some time.
No, thank you. Yeah, there's just a couple of things I wanted to flag because actually I lived in Gaza for 2 years, 2002, 2004. Not that means that, I'm omnipotent. But one thing that's really irritated me by his commentary is, first of all, like, there's the factual case, then you have the theoretical and the logical, and then the political, like what is to be done or questions. But it just seems that, at least the people that I've seen him talk to, no one ever pushes back on him. He can say the most outlandish stuff
Mm,
about Hamas. It seems like he hasn't seen anything in the New York Post, the New York Times that he hasn't accepted.
mm,
It's kind of like, okay, Islamist, terrorist, bad, that's it. Okay, it's a very partial, undialectic, unhistorical a consideration of this group and the broader resistance movement. I have no idea if the upper echelon of Hamas is raking in the dough or not. And in a way, it's beside the point. In Gaza, for example, what he would call the landowners or whatever, the people who weren't refugees, they far and away were Fatah supporters or members of Fatah. Hamas's base has always been the refugee camps, the poor and the more working class echelons of that area. No appreciation of that. And when talking about imperialism, he's saying, okay, we have the left now, especially the younger left, who are like, okay, we have to go and be in solidarity and protest Israel because it's a white settler colony and that's always bad. He wants to characterize that as the left saying the biggest obstacle to pursuing socialism in the Middle East is Israel. And he would say that actually it's Islamists. So he used Iran as an example in one video. He mentioned something about how the reason why the secular or socialist movement in Iran failed wasn't because of the West, it was because of Islamist reactionaries. And I thought, well, okay. One thing I would ask him is like, where do you get this information from? So your characterization of Hamas and of Palestinian resistance groups in general, where are you getting this information from? And then when it comes to religion or it comes to any of these movements, even though he claims to be very dialectical, all that goes out the window when it becomes about religion or nationalist movements. They're
right.
the same, dismissed or,
Yeah, he continues Trotsky's tradition of like being a cartoon Jacobin, which is like taking all anti-clerical slogans from Europe in the 18th and 19th century, principally that were directed at like the established church, and applying them without analyzing the situation to West Asia. The problem with that is that you're not investigating the facts before you're drawing your conclusion. He already has his conclusion. The facts don't matter. So let's talk about Islam and the West Asian region, because you can't just label like all these different disparate movements Islamist, which, by the way, is a term that was dreamed up by Washington and London reactionaries to justify the various wars of the last 20 years.
Yeah, this is a euphemism for terrorist, I think.
Yeah, basically, that's what it's meant to trigger in the mind of the listener. But what is the nature of these different movements? Now, the nature of like Hezbollah is that it was a movement of the dirt poor Shia population of South Lebanon that arose specifically in response to an Israeli invasion and occupation. And that's where its base is. That's why it's so strong, because it's a mass movement of the poor agricultural and urban working class in Lebanon. That's where it comes from. And it emerged because, to be blunt, the Arab left was either destroyed by the actions of imperialism or destroyed itself through its own internal failures. That's the other part of this. And so, where the left is destroyed or fails, and yet there is still an objective requirement for some kind of resistance, which I know Chris wouldn't agree with, there is still a requirement for the nation of Lebanon to be freed from imperial domination. There is still an objective requirement for the Palestinians to continue their national struggle. So where that requirement exists, something will fulfill it. Now, if that's not Palestinians or Lebanese left or wider Arab left, then they are going to gather around some kind of hub of resistance. And in that case, the only place that's left for them is the mosque and movements that emerge from a religious background. And now, I'm sure that people like Cutrone will say, oh, well, Hamas was created by the Zionists, which isn't true. But, let's just roll with this conventional explanation for a moment. Because it is true that at a certain point, the US and the Israelis thought, well, if we can encourage the growth of Hamas as an alternative to the PLO, that will give us a bit of an advantage.
Yeah, divide and conquer.
It's very simple stuff.
And also, they needed a more scary opposition because you had the PLO that was becoming too palatable. You have pictures of Arafat with various leaders and celebrities and do-gooders and whatnot. They needed someone to be, look, we would love to negotiate, but we can't deal with these people.
They're irrational.
But all
crazy, But the problem with that is, no movements don't stay the same as time goes on. through struggle, things evolve. Nothing is just stays constant, except Trotskyism. Trotskyism is constant and never changes. But like Hamas, as you said, it is rooted in the refugee camps. It comes out of the youth who have been dispossessed, who have only ever known dispossession. And as to this like absurd like meditation that he does and the cult of martyrdom and all that kind of stuff. By the way, the first suicide bombings in West Asia, I believe, they were done by secular socialists, actually in response also to the occupation of Lebanon by Israel in like the early 1980s. So the religious people didn't invent this concept. And there's an argument to say it was done even earlier by like certain anarchist bombers in like the early 20th century. So this idea that it's a religious concept of martyrdom is inaccurate. I mean, there is an old quote from Mao, which I'm going to just paraphrase here to say, where he says that to die for the masses is a death that is as weighty as a mountain, but to die for capital is a death that is as weighty as a feather. I don't know, of course, what goes through the mind of those men who go off and do commando operations for Hamas, but it seems a fairly similar thing that motivates them to that which motivated the earlier generation of nationalists and communists, which is that to sacrifice oneself for the idea of liberating your nation is something that at certain stages people will embrace because they see themselves as part of something much, much bigger, which necessitates a certain level of sacrifice. That's true of bourgeois revolutions back in the day. It's true of the English Revolution. It's true of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the levels of suicidal heroism attached to all of those things that happened during that time. Now, what he is rejecting, I think, is not the concept of like religious martyrdom. He's rejecting the concept that you could ever wish to, or anybody would ever get to a point where they would be prepared to sacrifice anything for a wider cause. It's not just Chris Cutrone that rejects that. I think the entire Western left rejects that. The idea of making that ultimate sacrifice and there ever being something that would make anybody do that, I think they reject that because fundamentally, I think they're all postmodernists now. They don't believe fundamentally that there will be any kind of movement, even of a class nature, which he says he wants, that would make people willing to undergo that level of sacrifice. Because I've said this on my own program many times, imperialism, whether home or away, will extract an incredibly heavy toll for you removing it from a particular area. You only need to look at the histories of the liberation wars after World War II. Like 1 million Algerians being killed inside a decade, which is astonishing numbers. Like 3 million Vietnamese, about the same number of Koreans. Countless people killed in Madagascar, countless people killed in Kenya by the British, Malaysia by the British. We should pose this to Mr. Cutrone. Why do those people, how are they able to endure that sacrifice? Because if it was the case that Hamas were just a bunch of gangsters, as he claims, who just had a gun to people's heads, well, you don't even need to be a Marxist to work this out. He should remember his Machiavelli. Better to be feared than loved, but better to always strive to not be hated. Because you can't just make people go and sacrifice themselves by putting a gun to their heads. So why did 1 million Algerians get killed and the struggle continue? Why did they not give up? Why did the Vietnamese not give up? Why aren't the Palestinians giving up? Because they have come to see the need for this liberation as a vital requirement, without which they cannot continue living in the old way. If Chris had read his Lenin properly, Lenin's definition of a revolutionary situation, part of which is that the masses are refused to live in the old way, and the ruling class cannot continue to rule in the old way. Well, in that case, you've got two parts of a revolutionary situation in West Asia right now. The masses are refusing to live in the old way. The ruling class cannot continue to rule in the old way. And so that pushes people to an extent where life becomes so unbearable that many make maybe it's conscious, maybe it's unconscious decision that a sacrifice is worth making to free ourselves from this immiseration. Because that's what the Palestinians were faced with, not joint struggle with the Israeli working class. The Israeli ruling class and the US behind them know very well how to keep things in order in terms of giving certain privileges to certain layers to make sure kind of unity cannot come about. So what they're faced with is dispossession, immiseration, and living in a high-tech prison. Now, if I was 20 years old and I was faced with that, I'd think that taking my chances in a gun battle with the Israelis was a good decision. Because what else do you have? Is your entire life going to be 2 miles? You
Mm.
know, is that it? Is
Well,
that
if I got his thing right, he was saying this I thought was kind of funny. He actually said that most of the left will put themselves in the position of Israel and basically try to ask, like, what can they do better? What should they do differently to be nicer or whatever it is? And he's like, no, I put myself in the position of a Palestinian. And I was thinking, really? But what he's doing is like if Chris Cutrone
hmm,
found himself to be in Gaza, what would he do?
run away?
But it was this thing like it's really not a prison. Yeah, there's difficulties, but better that than to be dead or bombed. Better to be a slave than to be exterminated. And other people made this argument basically that they got defeated, no real reason to go back and decide how right or wrong or cloudy the establishment of the state of Israel was. But that, too bad. And the best thing to do is just to get along as best as you can and hope for the best. So I wasn't buying it. I was like, really? And also, it's this chauvinism being like, who are you or anybody outside of there really to decide what was acceptable or not? I think it's quite right that they can't or he can't even imagine a situation where they'd be willing to take up arms against the enemy and be killed themselves for doing it. And I think that if you don't have a certain group of people who are willing to do that, good luck with any kind of serious change.
The other point I wanted to come back to was that he misuses the legacy of Lenin, but Marx and Engels themselves. If Chris Cutrone's point is that national liberation is fundamentally pointless, then why did Marx support the national liberation struggle in the first Indian War of Independence, known in Britain as the Indian Mutiny in the 1850s? Marx wrote very extensively on that and was in favor of Indian liberation, even though in the same articles, he was writing extensively about the limitations of the Indian national leaders. He was still saying this is a struggle that we wish should prevail. And again, like if it's all pointless and it's all just capitalism, were Marx and Engels wrong to support the Union in the American Civil War? Was that wrong? Should they have said that, well, it's just capitalism, whether it's wage slavery or chattel slavery, it's just capitalism?
The enslaved Africans and the white
Should have united as
they should have
rebels.
united, and then the Civil War wouldn't have been necessary. Yeah.
But this is where the logic leads, and we must go all the way back to 1848 and like the publication of the Communist Manifesto and look in there about, well, what do Marx and Engels identify as the conditions of struggle at each stage? Like at one stage, towards the end of the book, they're talking about how should communists interact with political struggles as they exist in that current period, which is the 1840s. And they didn't change their view on this, even though the movements changed and the nations changed. The method they outline there is that communists should engage with these mass movements that actually take, and in the case of themselves, German society forward. So side with the German liberals, German liberal bourgeois against the feudal reactionaries on the grounds that would chase out the feudal remnants, help develop the productive forces, help the forces that were pushing towards ultimately German unity, in the full knowledge that they were limited, in the full knowledge that struggle was not going to lead magically to the liberation of the proletariat, but it was an important step in terms of progress. And they always insisted also that even when you are in a temporary alliance with such forces, communists must maintain their own organization, maintain the right to develop their own ideas, not compromise their program. But if you can reach an agreement with a certain political force on certain areas that will take a vital struggle forward, then you should do so. So that wasn't something that was invented by Lenin or Mao or Stalin. That's right there at the very beginning of the Marxist tradition, that method of struggle. And again, he completely ignores that, completely ignores the legacy of Marx and Engels supporting, for instance, the liberation struggle of the Irish, which I'm sure Chris would also say was pointless. So to get to the point where he is, he needs to basically like bastardize Lenin, completely ignore all the work done by Marx and Engels on the liberation struggles of the 19th century, and of course call everything else that happened bad Stalinism in the 20th century. He mentions at one point how useless BDS is, and he makes some sort of, sordid joke about BDSM and stuff like that. And then maybe giving away something, I don't know. And then he starts talking about South Africa and saying, oh, well, it was useless in South Africa. That wasn't what liberated the South Africans. Now, it's true that the defeat of the apartheid regime was the work principally of the South African proletariat itself, because in those times, I think it was 99% or so, or around about that, of the South African proletariat was the black population. Race and class there in those times were almost exactly synonymous with each other. So it was their militant struggles from the 50s through to the late 80s, which eventually uprooted the apartheid system, made it ungovernable. Part of that was the armed national liberation struggle committed by the ANC's armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, which included bombings, it included gun attacks and gun battles with the South African security forces. Another part of that was military defeat in Namibia. Defeat by Namibian forces, Angolan forces, but also backed up by Cuban internationalist forces sent by the Cuban government to aid in the national liberation struggle of what was then Southwest Africa, formerly German Southwest Africa, given to the Union of South Africa by the British. And it was the white-led forces of the apartheid regime losing to a coalition of Namibians, Angolans, and largely black Cuban soldiers, which was a huge disaster for them in terms of their projection of their supposed superiority, which, of course, we know from Frantz Fanon's work is vital to colonialism's survival, is the projection of technological, civilizational, and racial supremacy. And if you take that away from them, it all falls apart. I'm sure Chris Cutrone would dismiss this as, I don't know, Soviet imperialism or bureaucratic capitalism or whatever the hell he would call it. But it was military defeat and disaster combined with armed struggle, combined with mass resistance and uprisings by the black working class at home, came together to destroy the apartheid regime. Yes, boycott and divestment movement didn't bring it down, but it did start to damage the reputation of the big South African mining companies, and it did force organizations like Barclays to at least stop doing business with them for a little while because it was damaging their reputation. No one claims that boycott and divestment is what brought down apartheid. That's a silly claim. It played a role in the ultimate isolation and defeat of the apartheid regime. And who was on the apartheid regime's side right up to the bitter end? Was Israel there with them. And they were allies up to the end. So again, like everywhere we turn to actual liberation struggles, Chris Cutrone's rather tortured logic, it just falls to pieces. Look at real world struggle. But that's why he has to retreat into a world of what he would call pure class analysis, because there you can live in a fantasy world which involves you creating fantasy versions of all the things you say you're actually in favor of, including Lenin himself.
Yeah, I don't know if where uneven and combined development comes in, but like you said, you have to deal with the situation as it is with the forces and the players that are on the board and make the best decisions that you can. None of us have crystal balls, or perhaps he does, or a crystal ball, crystal balls, as he does. But why wouldn't the national bourgeoisie with connections in the area be always preferable to imperialism, where you don't have any real control at all for the development of your country?
This is the point. At least with the national bourgeois, those who are interested in industrial and agricultural development, to the point where at least the nation becomes not just a mono economy, an extraction economy, where at least there's money brought back in to develop it, you know, where at least if you're dealing with them in terms of the class struggle being against them, then you're dealing with an enemy which is at least based in your own country, principally, rather than having to deal with an enemy which takes all of the wealth to London or New York or Paris or Berlin. To get to the stage where you can wage an effective class struggle, then again, you have to actually take the lead from, well, the bad guys who Chris doesn't want to listen to, like Mao, like Stalin, like Castro, and many others, like Thomas Sankara, who realized that if you don't sever the link with the colonial power, then the development of the country just can't happen in the normal way. And like in the long struggle in places like Nicaragua and Venezuela, there's a reason why that struggle's taking such a long time. One of the reasons is because they have to free themselves, to go through this long process of freeing themselves from US imperialism, including, of course, isolating and defeating the comprador elements, the elements in the ruling class which are tied completely to US imperialism, who do all their business with US imperialism, who have villas in Florida that they want to escape to if things go wrong. Mao writes about how they assessed each stage of the struggle in China. Like it went from a struggle against the Western imperialists in the 1920s and then the warlord in their employ to a struggle against then like the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek. But then all of that had to be put aside because they had to commit themselves, however difficult it was, to a joint struggle against the Japanese. And at each stage of the struggle, like a proper leadership examines the situation, examines the forces in play, and considers what moves should be made. Where should we go? You know, how strong are our forces? How strong are the enemy's forces? Who is the principal enemy at this stage? It's much easier to just sit there and say, when you put it on a t-shirt which says "fuck capitalism," or if you're an anarchist, fuck the state, spelt with an 8. You know, because I used to wear that t-shirt.
Everybody wants a shortcut. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's easy. It enables you to run, you know, your own think tank in the form of the Platypus Society, in Chris Cutrone's case, and it will get you a nice gig as a controversialist, a man of controversy, a provocateur, a Christopher Hitchens type, if you will, who'll come on and say things which sound really radical, but when you break them down, amount to a demand that the oppressed of the world basically put up with it.
Yeah.
Until a perfect solution arrives.
There was a variety of ways that he strawmans or dismisses pro-Palestinian solidarity or anything like that, especially with students. He was actually irritated when students left his class because there was some sort of walkout in solidarity with Palestine. He was like, really, you're really going to walk out? You think that's a better use of your time than staying here and learning something about Marx? Basically, that dismisses as third worldism. He would consider us fantasists, be like, you know, this idea that over there's something going on. There's somebody fighting the fight. There's someone standing up to the man, whatever. And we should support them, even though what we're supporting is just them to die for nothing, is basically the argument he's making. Because he's decided, or he's quite clear, that he knows how this is going to end. It's not going to end in any way that's favorable for any Palestinian. So basically, anybody who's supporting this in any way is basically supporting needless death. No matter how we want to rationalize it to ourselves, because they're the occupied, so we have to stand with them, or we're against colonialism, or whatever it is. Because he's also a military strategist.
Yeah. Well, so was Trotsky, you know?
Yeah. What I want to end on is this notion that either the revolution happens in America or it's not going to happen. And I think this is his beef, or that side's beef, with the people who pay too much attention to what's going on in China. And he would say somehow kid themselves that what's going on in China is actually the vanguard, or is actually going to lead to any kind of socialism that isn't just nominal. And he also thinks that multipolarity, that's also still a fantasy. So this dismissing as third worldism, we're just supporting people to die for no reason or to be bombed for no reason. And that we're kidding ourselves. We think that someplace else outside of America can be like the vanguard for any kind of meaningful socialist revolution. That the US in the end still can crush anything in the periphery, and that we should accept that.
Well, I'd ask Chris, why was it that the US didn't win in Vietnam? You know, if you can crush anything, why does the DPRK still exist? If you can crush anything, why didn't they march into Iran in 1980? Why did they get their hired goon Saddam Hussein to do it for them? If they can crush anything, why aren't they winning in Ukraine? You know, why are they getting Ukrainians to die in gigantic numbers for them? Why didn't they, as I think it was Scott Ritter suggested it in an interview I did with him 2 years ago. He said, well, if the US was not scared of Russia, why didn't they just stick the 101st Airborne in Kiev and say, come on, we dare you? They didn't do that. They hid behind the Ukrainians. And so this idea that the US is immortal, I've seen this from many people in the West. I think it's more of a desperate affirmation that they tell themselves, because it's not immortal. When Mao said US imperialism is a paper tiger, what did he mean? He meant that its strength, whilst not illusory, was much weaker than it appeared. Why? Because the link between the American ruling class and their own masses was much weaker than it appeared to be. And that has been the case, especially since Vietnam. And that's why, of course, they did away with the draft, because they're terrified of internal revolts. And so the wars they wage have to be kept away from the American masses. They have to be isolated as far as possible. The number of people who do military service in the United States is like less than 1% of the population. It's a tiny number, largely in isolated communities and very poor communities in terms of the rank and file. So if they're unafraid and if their triumph is inevitable, then why are they losing everywhere? And to go back to the point that Cutrone makes about, well, it's got to happen in the United States or it can't happen anywhere. In the end, there is a slither of truth in that. The US imperialist system can only really, in the end, be ended internally. It can only really be ended by the American worker. But that doesn't mean that what's happening with China and BRICS and all the other emergent multipolarism doesn't matter, because that's draining the ability of US imperialism to extract wealth from other areas of the world, which is making the inevitability of revolution inside the United States speed up because the system's in deeper and deeper crises. Somebody who actually had studied Marx and had studied Lenin, as Chris claims to have done, would understand those points. He is a transparent chauvinist because he's got this idea, he's got the same view of America that John Bolton does, or Victoria Nuland does, which is that if it's not happening here, it doesn't count. Well, history of the last 100 years has already disproved that. Like, direct colonialism now is not possible. You can't do it anymore. The examples of national liberation struggles stemming from the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, have basically rendered direct colonialism, direct military occupation to be impossible to sustain. It's why the US failed in Afghanistan. It's why the US failed in Iraq. It's why Israel is falling to pieces now. And so if Chris is serious, he should commit himself to helping to organize the US working class in a revolt against US imperialism. Certain people in the US are trying to do that now, but I bet he rejects them as well. The Trotskyites will never find a struggle that the masses are willing to invest in that they can't find something wrong with. And so it will remain.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Alexander. I appreciate you coming on and giving us your take on Cutrone's Bad Trot Take. And there's links in the video description to the 2 articles that we talked about, and also a video that he did with Theory Underground. Always try to keep in mind that just because someone's talking a good game doesn't necessarily mean that you should buy into it wholeheartedly. The factual case he seems to be implying is quite partial to have the nicest characterization. And that I had a feeling that his argument about anti-imperialism is not Marxism was overdone. And so I really appreciate you coming on and going through in such detail a Marxist analysis, that there is a politics, there's political avenues that follow from that aren't just stepping back and being like, nothing for us here. So as we close out here, Chris likes to always say that the reason why he got back involved in doing these things is because of the students. So if you were to hypothetically come across a group of students who were motivated to protest or do whatever they could in support of Palestinians, you have Chris on one side basically saying, like, look, children, this is reactionary. This has nothing to do with Marxism or the task of attaining socialism. What advice would you give people maybe just looking at it in terms of bad guy, good guy, to kind of bring in the Marxist part of it?
I would say, if asked, that their instincts have been correct and that their instinct to want to struggle against this is correct. What I would always say is that the struggle, in terms of the political struggle, must always go alongside further study of imperialism as a system. A lot of people are drawn into this, as you imply in your question, out of revulsion. They see what the Israeli regime is doing, they see what US imperialism did, and they're horrified and disgusted by it. And that moral outrage drives them to hit the streets and protest, etc. That's a good start. I mean, it's where we all start. It's a very human, empathetic response. I would say this: if the Korean People's Army and the Chinese Red Army can read Marxist classics while struggling against Japanese militarism and US imperialism, then we can as well whilst doing our work. Say that to be, go and study more. This applies to all of us. Build your understanding of the system that created and sustains Israel. Build your understanding of, like, why is it that every single US politician from the left to the right, from AOC to Donald fucking Trump, is absolutely 100% committed to Israel? Why is that? Interrogate that question as part of your action. What is the role of academic institutions? Why is it that they're so linked to arms companies? Why is it that they're so linked to very dubious technology companies? Why do they get massive endowments from, like, members of the bourgeoisie who are very dubious at best? What role does the university system play in the imperialist world? Do not neglect the wider study, and always strive to build an understanding of the micro level of these horrific crimes which rightly turn everybody's stomach. but build the understanding as to why it's happening. And don't just keep getting outraged and outraged and outraged, because you will exhaust yourself and you will exhaust the potential in your struggle. Build the understanding and be prepared, which I wish somebody had said this to me 20 years ago during the Iraq War, and I might have benefited from it. Be prepared to have your movement defeated, and you be prepared to appear to lose.
Yeah.
That's not a negative thing, because if I'd have had that understanding when I was 20, that would have benefited me enormously, because I just dropped out when we lost over the Iraq thing. He just dropped out and got depressed for another 5 or 6 years after that, because it just felt like, well, we can't do anything. What's the point? Because I didn't understand why we'd lost, or why having the war was so important to British imperialism, because I didn't understand British imperialism, because we were in a movement that didn't encourage us to read or understand anything. It was governed purely by moral outrage, and because they just kept sticking more and more heinous things in front of us and saying, look, that's awful, let's go out and get angry about that. The understanding, the ability to bring together the theoretical and the practical political side, and then analyze, discuss, and then act, you end up exhausting yourself with a series of useless actions, which is what we ended up doing. This was me 20 years ago, running around endlessly, feeling like I was a revolutionary. But I didn't understand the situation. I got myself there by being disgusted by things. So to bring it back to your question, I'd say to any student who got active in this, that they have taken a really important first step in understanding the system we live in. But don't stop there. Keep developing it. Keep reading and studying and learning with others and testing the theories out as you build your process, as you build your actions, and become part of an actual Marxist-Leninist organization as well, if one is available to you. Because by joining together with comrades who are on the same path that you are, you can discuss, debate, and learn in person. And that's vital, because if you just sat on the internet, again, in the perpetual outrage machine, again, you're going to go mad or get exhausted. So important first step, but we must always say that a first step is just a first step. And it is part of this struggle that younger people are entering into that necessitates an awful lot of hard work to build a proper understanding. And we're all still learning too.
And I just want to jump in to say that we have to realize that maybe it's particularly harder for the younger generation with everything being so immediate, that this isn't a sprint, this is a marathon. It could be the things that you participate in and the learning through failure and picking yourselves up again and making a record of that. We may not see the best fruit of that in our lifetime. Hope for the best, but expect the long haul.
Right.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, comrade.
Thanks, Tara. Good to talk to you.
You as well. See you next time. All right. So again, here's Alexander's details. You can follow him on Twitter. Also, please like and subscribe to Morbid Symptoms. Thank you for tuning in.